The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Martinez adjusted her uniform for the 100th time. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down the crisp fabric, knowing that today would determine whether her months of training had been worth the sacrifice. At 23, she had already overcome more obstacles than most people faced in a lifetime, but nothing had prepared her for the crushing disappointment that awaited her in Colonel Harrison's office. Sarah had grown up in a small town where opportunities were scarce, especially for young women with dreams bigger than the local diner or grocery store. Her father, a mechanic with calloused hands and infinite wisdom, had always told her that success wasn't about where you started, but about how determined you were to reach your destination. Those words echoed in her mind as she walked through the military compound, observing the organized chaos of soldiers preparing for their daily duties. The recruitment office had painted a picture of unlimited possibilities. They spoke of leadership opportunities, technical training, and the chance to serve her country in meaningful ways. Sarah had scored exceptionally well on all her aptitude tests, particularly in strategic planning and logistics. Her instructors during basic training had noted her analytical mind and natural ability to see patterns that others missed. She had graduated third in her class, with commendations for excellence in tactical studies. But as she stood outside Colonel Harrison's office, waiting to receive her first assignment, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The other graduates from her program had already been called in, and she had heard whispers of exciting postings to intelligence units, communications divisions, and strategic planning departments. When her name was finally called, she entered the office with confidence, expecting to discuss her preferences for assignment. Colonel Harrison was a stern man in his 50s, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything with military precision. His office walls were covered with maps, commendations, and photographs from various military operations. He barely looked up from his paperwork as Sarah stood at attention, waiting for permission to speak. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before he finally acknowledged her presence. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from decades of command. "I've reviewed your file, and I have your assignment." Sarah's heart raced with anticipation, imagining herself contributing to important military operations, using her skills to make a real difference. She had dreams of analyzing enemy movements, developing strategic responses, or coordinating complex logistics operations. Instead, Colonel Harrison handed her a single sheet of paper with an assignment that made her stomach drop. Coffee duty, kitchen support, administrative assistance for the officer's mess. The words blurred together as she tried to process what she was reading. This wasn't a temporary assignment or a stepping stone to something better. This was her job, the role they had determined she was best suited for after all her training and demonstrated capabilities. "Sir," Sarah said, struggling to keep her voice steady, "I believe there might be some mistake. My test scores and training evaluations indicate that I'm qualified for strategic or analytical positions." Her voice sounded smaller than she intended, and she hated the way it betrayed her disappointment. Colonel Harrison finally looked up from his desk, his expression showing neither surprise nor sympathy. "There's no mistake, Martinez. The military has needs at every level, and someone has to fill support roles. Your job is to ensure that the officers have what they need to do their jobs effectively. Coffee meals, clean facilities, these things matter more than you might think." The explanation felt like a slap in the face. Sarah had watched male classmates with lower scores and less impressive training records receive assignments to prestigious units. She had seen soldiers with less dedication and fewer qualifications move directly into leadership development programs. Yet here she was being told that her highest and best use was serving coffee and cleaning up after others. "But, sir, my analytical scores were in the top 5%. I have recommendations from 3 different instructors who said I showed exceptional promise for strategic work." Sarah knew she was walking a fine line between advocating for herself and appearing insubordinate, but She couldn't let this happen without at least trying to fight for something better. The colonel's expression hardened. Martinez, let me be clear about something. The military is not a democracy, and assignments are not up for negotiation. You will report to Sergeant Williams in the officers' mess at 0600 tomorrow morning. You will perform your duties with the same excellence you presumably brought to your training, and you will do so without complaint or further discussion. Is that understood? Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. Every dream she had nurtured during training, every vision of herself making a meaningful contribution to her country's defense, crumbled in that moment. But she had been taught to follow orders, to maintain discipline even in the face of disappointment. Yes, sir. Understood, sir. As she left the colonel's office, Sarah felt a mixture of emotions that she struggled to contain. Anger at the unfairness of the situation, disappointment in a system that seemed to waste talent, and a deep sadness at the realization that her dreams might have been naive from the beginning. She walked through the base in a daze, barely registering the sounds of military life continuing around her. The officers' mess was located in a building near the center of the compound, easily accessible from the various administrative buildings where senior staff worked. It was a place she had passed dozens of times during training, but never entered. Now would become her primary workplace, the place where she would spend her days ensuring that coffee was fresh, meals were served on time, and tables were properly cleaned. That evening, Sarah called her father from the payphone outside the barracks. His voice was warm and familiar, a reminder of home and simpler times. She tried to keep the disappointment out of her voice as she explained her assignment, but her father knew her too well to be fooled. Mija, he said, using the Spanish nickname that always made her feel like a child again. Sometimes life gives us situations that don't match our expectations. But you know what I've learned in 53 years? Opportunity doesn't always come dressed the way we expect it to. Sarah wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Dad, I'm going to be serving coffee. After all that training, all those hopes, I'm going to be invisible, just another person in the background that nobody notices or values. Her father was quiet for a moment, and she could almost picture him in his workshop, thinking carefully before speaking. Let me tell you something about invisible people, Sarah. Sometimes they're the ones who see everything. Sometimes they're the ones who understand how things really work. And sometimes, when the moment comes, they're the ones who can make the biggest difference because nobody saw them coming. His words provided some comfort, but Sarah still went to bed that night feeling like her future had been stolen from her. She stared at the ceiling of the barracks, listening to the breathing of her roommates, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake by joining the military. Maybe she should have stayed home, found some other way to build a life for herself. But as dawn approached, Sarah made a decision that would define everything that came after. She would not let this assignment defeat her. She would not become bitter or give up on her dreams entirely. Instead, she would find a way to prove her worth, even if it meant starting from the bottom. She would use this position to learn about the military from a different perspective, to understand how decisions were made and operations were planned. What Sarah didn't know as she prepared for her first day of coffee duty was that the officers' mess was not just a place where military leaders ate and drank coffee. It was a hub of information, a place where strategic discussions happened during informal moments, where she would overhear conversations about troop movements, supply challenges, and tactical problems that kept senior officers awake at night. She also didn't know that Colonel Harrison's office was connected to the mess hall through a service corridor, and that his personal conference room was located just steps away from where she would be working. Most importantly, she had no idea that in just a few weeks, she would stumble upon a critical error in military planning that could cost lives, an error that everyone else had missed, but that her analytical mind would spot immediately. As Sarah reported for her first day of coffee duty, she carried herself with as much dignity as she could muster. She introduced herself to Sergeant Williams, a career soldier who managed the day-to-day operations of the officers' facilities. Williams was a practical man who appreciated hard work and attention to detail, and He quickly recognized that Sarah brought more qualifications to the job than most soldiers assigned to support duties. "Martinez," he said after reviewing her file, "I can see you're probably not thrilled about this assignment. But let me tell you something, this place is the heart of everything that happens on this base. You pay attention, you work hard, and you might learn more about military operations than you would in any classroom." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak without betraying her emotions. She spent that first day learning the routines, understanding the preferences of different officers, and familiarizing herself with the layout of the facility. It was mundane work, but she approached it with the same methodical attention to detail that had made her successful in training. As the days passed, Sarah began to notice patterns. She observed which officers worked late into the night, which ones seemed stressed about particular operations, and which conversations stopped abruptly when she entered a room. She started to understand the informal hierarchy that existed alongside the official chain of command, recognizing who actually made decisions and who simply implemented them. The work was often tedious, but Sarah found herself developing an appreciation for the behind-the-scenes operations that kept the military functioning. She learned about supply chains, communication protocols, and the countless details that had to be managed to support even simple operations. It wasn't the glamorous analytical work she had dreamed of, but it was education of a different kind. 3 weeks into her assignment, Sarah was cleaning tables in the main dining area when she overheard a heated discussion between Colonel Harrison and Major Peterson, the base's chief logistics officer. They were arguing about a supply convoy that was scheduled to travel through a region that intelligence reports suggested might be compromised. Sarah tried not to appear as if she was listening, but their voices carried across the room. "The route is the most direct path to the outpost," Major Peterson was saying. "Any deviation adds 2 days to the journey, and they're running critically low on medical supplies. Colonel Harrison sounded frustrated. I understand the time pressure, but if the intelligence is accurate, we could be sending those men straight into an ambush. The risk assessment shows multiple potential threat points along that corridor." Sarah continued wiping down tables, but her analytical mind was already processing the information she was hearing. She had studied route planning extensively during her training, and something about their discussion triggered a memory of geographical features she had memorized during strategic studies. There was something they weren't considering, some factor that could change the entire equation. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk thinking about the conversation she had overheard. She knew she had no business involving herself in strategic planning decisions, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was a solution they hadn't explored. The next morning, she reported to work early and spent her break time in the base library, reviewing maps and intelligence reports that were available to all personnel. What she discovered would change everything, not just for the endangered convoy, but for her own future in the military. Sarah found herself standing at the threshold of an opportunity that would prove her father's words about invisible people sometimes being the ones who see everything. But first, she would have to find the courage to speak up and risk everything she had worked so hard to achieve. As Sarah prepared for another day of coffee duty, she had no way of knowing that within hours, her careful observations and analytical skills would uncover a critical oversight that could save lives and, finally, demonstrate the true value of her capabilities. The maps she had studied the night before held the key to a solution that had eluded the senior staff, and her position in the officers' mess was about to become the platform from which she would launch her real military career. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the officers' mess as Sarah methodically prepared the coffee service for what had become her daily routine. For weeks had passed since her assignment began, and she had settled into a rhythm that allowed her to anticipate the needs of the officers while remaining largely invisible to their important discussions. But today felt different. The tension in the air was palpable as senior staff members arrived earlier than usual, their faces marked with the kind of concern that comes from making decisions that affect human lives. Sarah had spent the previous evening in the library, poring over topographical maps and historical data about the region where the supply convoy was scheduled to travel. Her training in strategic analysis had taught her to look beyond the obvious routes and consider factors that others might overlook. What she had discovered kept her awake most of the night, and now she faced the most difficult decision of her military career thus far. As she arranged fresh pastries and checked the coffee temperature, Sarah observed Colonel Harrison entering the mess hall with Major Peterson and Captain Rodriguez, the intelligence officer responsible for threat assessment. Their body language suggested they were still struggling with the convoy route decision, and she could hear fragments of their conversation as they settled at their usual table near the window. The satellite imagery from yesterday confirms increased activity in the primary corridor, Captain Rodriguez was explaining as Sarah discreetly refilled their coffee cups. We're seeing vehicle movements consistent with hostile reconnaissance operations. But the alternative routes would add significant time to the mission, and the medical supplies are desperately needed. Major Peterson spread a large map across the table, weighing down the corners with coffee cups and his notebook. "Look here," he said, pointing to a marked path on the map. "This is our planned route through the valley. It's the most direct path, but intelligence suggests there could be ambush points here, and here." His finger traced locations that Sarah had studied extensively the night before. Colonel Harrison leaned forward, studying the map with the intense focus of someone who understood that his decisions could determine whether soldiers returned home safely. "What about this northern route through the mountain pass? It would avoid the valley entirely." "That route is completely impassable this time of year," Captain Rodriguez replied. "The recent rainfall has made the mountain roads unstable, and we've had reports of landslides blocking key sections. We need engineering teams to clear the path, which would take at least a week." Sarah continued her duties, but every fiber of her being was focused on their conversation. The map they were studying was spread out just feet from where she was working, and she could see the routes they were discussing. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar motions of her job, while her mind raced through the geographical data she had memorized. "What about splitting the convoy?" Major Peterson suggested. "Send smaller groups along different routes to minimize risk." Colonel Harrison shook his head. "The medical supplies need to arrive together, and smaller groups would be more vulnerable if they encounter trouble. We need a solution that gets everything there safely and quickly." As Sarah listened to their discussion, she realized they were missing a crucial piece of information that could solve their problem entirely. During her research the night before, she had discovered an old military access road that didn't appear on their current maps. The road had been built during a previous conflict and was designed specifically for supply convoys, with strategic advantages that made it nearly impossible to ambush. More importantly, recent satellite imagery showed that the road was still in good condition and completely clear of obstacles. The weight of her knowledge felt crushing as Sarah continued to move around the room, refilling coffee and clearing plates while the three officers struggled with a problem she could solve in minutes. She knew the protocol. Junior personnel did not interrupt senior staff meetings, especially not support staff assigned to menial duties. But she also knew that lives were at stake, and her training had taught her that the mission always came first. Sarah made her decision as she watched Colonel Harrison run his hands through his hair in frustration. She approached their table with the coffee pot in hand, her heart pounding so hard she was certain they could hear it. "Excuse me, sir," she said quietly, directing her words to Colonel Harrison. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I believe I might have information relevant to your route planning discussion." The three officers looked up in surprise, as if they had forgotten that anyone else was in the room. Major Peterson's expression showed annoyance at the interruption, while Captain Rodriguez looked confused about why support staff would involve themselves in strategic planning. Colonel Harrison's face was unreadable, but Sarah could see him assessing the situation and deciding how to respond. "Martinez, isn't it?" Colonel Harrison said after a moment. "You're assigned to coffee duty here." His tone was neither encouraging nor dismissive, simply factual. Yes, sir, Sarah replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. I couldn't help but overhear your discussion about convoy routes, and during my personal time, I've been studying the geographical data for that region. I believe there's an option you haven't considered. Major Peterson's eyebrows rose in what appeared to be irritation. Martinez, route planning requires years of experience and specialized training. I don't think coffee duty qualifies you to contribute to strategic decisions. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she forced herself to continue. Sir, I understand your concern, but my training included extensive work in logistics and route analysis. I scored in the top 5% in strategic studies, and I've identified a route that doesn't appear on your current maps. The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of military life continuing outside. Sarah realized she was at a point of no return. She could either press forward with her suggestion or retreat and spend the rest of her military career wondering if her silence had cost lives. The faces of the officers showed a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, but Colonel Harrison gestured for her to continue. There's an old military access road built approximately 15 years ago during Operation Desert Shield, Sarah explained, her confidence growing as she moved into familiar analytical territory. It runs parallel to your primary route, but approximately 8 miles to the west, following a ridge line that provides natural protection from ambush points. The road was specifically designed for convoy operations and includes strategic advantage points for communication and defensive positioning. Captain Rodriguez leaned forward with interest. I'm not familiar with any such road in that area. Our current maps don't show anything matching that description. Sarah nodded. The road was constructed as part of a classified operation and was never added to standard military maps after the conflict ended. However, it's documented in the historical archives, and recent satellite imagery confirms that it remains in excellent condition. More importantly, the route would actually be shorter than your primary option by approximately 12 miles. The three officers exchanged glances, and Sarah could see them reassessing their initial dismissal of her input. Colonel Harrison studied her face with the intensity he usually reserved for battle plans. Martinez, these are serious claims. If you're wrong about this road, or if your information is outdated, we could be sending a convoy into an impossible situation. I understand the responsibility, sir, Sarah replied. That's why I spent last evening verifying the information through multiple sources. The road exists, it's passable, and it would eliminate the primary threat points you're concerned about while reducing travel time. Major Peterson looked skeptical but curious. Even if such a road exists, how do we verify its current condition without sending a reconnaissance team? That would take days we don't have. Sarah had anticipated this question during her research. Sir, the satellite imagery from 48 hours ago shows clear tire tracks on the road surface, indicating recent civilian or military use. Additionally, there's a communication relay station built into the ridge at the halfway point that could provide real-time updates on convoy progress. The officers fell silent again, but this time Sarah could sense that their silence came from serious consideration rather than dismissal. Colonel Harrison stood and walked to the window, looking out at the base while processing what she had told them. When he turned back to face the table, his expression had changed from skepticism to cautious interest. Captain Rodriguez, I want you to pull all available intelligence on that sector immediately. Look for any references to historical military construction or access roads. Major Peterson, contact our satellite imaging department and request enhanced photography of the area Martinez described. Both officers nodded and began gathering their materials, clearly taking her suggestion seriously. Martinez, Colonel Harrison continued, I want you to report to my office in 1 hour with every piece of documentation you used in your research. If your information proves accurate, this could be exactly what we need. If you're wrong, or if you've wasted our time with incomplete analysis, there will be consequences. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Completely understood, Sarah replied, her voice stronger now that she had committed fully to her course of action. As the officers left the mess hall, Sarah realized that her entire military career was about to change direction. She had stepped far beyond the boundaries of her assigned role, and the results would either vindicate her decision or end her military aspirations entirely. There was no middle ground, no safe retreat back to the anonymity of coffee duty. For the next hour, Sarah gathered every piece of research she had compiled, organizing it into a presentation that would either prove her value as an analytical asset or demonstrate her incompetence as a support staff member who had overstepped her authority. She reviewed satellite images, historical documents, topographical surveys, and intelligence reports, double-checking every detail that supported her route recommendation. When she arrived at Colonel Harrison's office, she found him waiting with the same 3 officers plus 2 additional staff members she didn't recognize. The room felt formal and intimidating, with all eyes focused on her as she entered. Colonel Harrison gestured to a chair at the conference table where maps and documents were spread out in organized chaos. "Martinez, before we begin, I want to be clear about something," Colonel Harrison said as she took her seat. "What happens in this room today will determine not just the safety of that convoy, but also the trajectory of your military career. We spent the last hour trying to verify your claims, and what we found is both impressive and concerning." Sarah's heart raced as she waited for him to continue. Through the window, she could see soldiers going about their daily routines, unaware that a decision made in this room might save or cost the lives of their fellow service members. The weight of responsibility felt enormous, but Sarah knew she had to see this through to its conclusion. "Captain Rodriguez has confirmed the existence of the road you described," Colonel Harrison continued. "Historical records show it was indeed built during Operation Desert Shield and was classified until 3 years ago. Satellite imagery confirms that it appears to be in usable condition. However, we still have concerns about current security conditions and the reliability of using an unmapped route for such a critical mission." Major Peterson leaned forward. "Martinez, assuming your route recommendation proves viable, how do you suggest we address the communication and coordination challenges of using an uncharted path? Standard convoy protocols assume mapped routes with known checkpoint locations." Sarah had anticipated this question as well. Her research had been thorough precisely because she knew that partial solutions would be worse than no solution at all. "Sir, the historical documentation shows that the road includes 3 strategic communication points built into elevated positions along the ridge. These were designed specifically for convoy coordination and should still be functional. Additionally, the route connects with standard military roads at both ends, so integration with normal protocols would be straightforward." One of the officers she didn't recognize spoke up. "Martinez, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Davis from Strategic Planning. I have to ask, how does a soldier assigned to coffee duty have access to classified historical documents and satellite imagery? These aren't typically available to support personnel." Sarah had dreaded this question because it touched on the gray areas of military protocol. "Sir, the historical documents were declassified 3 years ago and are available in the base library. The satellite imagery I referenced is from open-source intelligence reports that are accessible to all personnel for personal research purposes. I didn't access anything beyond my clearance level, but I did approach my research with the same thoroughness I was trained to use in strategic analysis." The room fell quiet as the officers processed both her explanation and the implications of what she had accomplished. Sarah realized that she was no longer just a support staff member who had stumbled onto useful information. She had demonstrated analytical capabilities that matched or exceeded what they expected from their strategic planning teams, and she had done it using only the resources available to any motivated soldier. Colonel Harrison looked around the table at his staff, and Sarah could see a silent conversation taking place through their expressions and small gestures. Finally, he turned back to face her directly. "Martinez, based on your research and recommendations, we're going to authorize a reconnaissance mission to verify the condition of this road. If it proves viable, we'll use your route for the convoy mission. The relief Sarah felt was immediately tempered by Colonel Harrison's next words. However, I want you to understand that this situation has raised serious questions about your current assignment and capabilities. After this convoy mission is complete, you and I will need to have a comprehensive discussion about your future role in this military. As Sarah left Colonel Harrison's office, she realized that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Whether the convoy mission succeeded or failed, she would no longer be invisible, no longer be just another support staff member serving coffee and cleaning tables. She had proven that talent and determination could overcome institutional limitations, but she had also learned that taking such risks came with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate situation. That afternoon, as she resumed her coffee duty responsibilities, Sarah watched the officers who had dismissed her just hours earlier treat her with a new level of respect and curiosity. The conversation had shifted from whether she belonged in strategic discussions to what role she should play in future operations. It was both exhilarating and terrifying to realize that her military career was about to be completely redefined based on the success or failure of a convoy mission that would follow a route she had discovered through her own determination and analytical skills. 2 days passed before the reconnaissance team returned with their assessment of Sarah's proposed route, and those 48 hours felt like the longest of her military career. She continued her coffee duty responsibilities, but the atmosphere in the officers' mess had changed dramatically. Conversations quieted when she entered rooms, not from dismissal, but from curiosity about the soldier who had potentially solved a critical strategic problem while serving pastries and maintaining coffee supplies. The reconnaissance team had departed before dawn on the first day, equipped with communication gear and detailed instructions to evaluate not just the road condition, but also the strategic advantages and potential vulnerabilities of the route Sarah had discovered. Colonel Harrison had made it clear that their assessment would determine both the fate of the convoy mission and Sarah's future in the military. No pressure, Sarah thought wryly as she went through her daily routines while mentally rehearsing every detail of her research. On the morning of the third day, Sarah was arranging fresh flowers in the main dining area when she heard vehicles approaching the base. Through the window, she could see military trucks bearing the distinctive markings of the reconnaissance unit, and her heart began racing as she realized that the moment of truth had arrived. Within minutes, the team leader would report their findings to Colonel Harrison, and she would learn whether her analytical work had been brilliant insight or dangerous miscalculation. Captain Martinez, no relation, despite sharing the same surname, entered the officer's mess looking tired but satisfied. He nodded to Sarah as he passed, heading directly to Colonel Harrison's office for the debriefing. Sarah tried to focus on her duties, but every fiber of her being was straining to hear any fragment of conversation from the adjoining conference room. The waiting felt interminable as officers came and went, their expressions giving no indication of what the reconnaissance team had discovered. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Sergeant Williams approached Sarah with instructions that made her stomach drop. "Martinez, Colonel Harrison wants to see you in his office immediately. And he said to bring your research materials with you." Sarah gathered her documentation, her hands trembling slightly as she organized the papers that represented weeks of careful analysis. She had no idea whether she was being summoned to receive commendation or court-martial proceedings, but she knew that her military career was about to be defined by whatever waited behind Colonel Harrison's office door. When she entered the office, Sarah found Colonel Harrison seated behind his desk with Captain Martinez and Major Peterson flanking him. The reconnaissance team leader looked directly at her as she stood at attention, and she thought she detected the hint of a smile on his weathered face. But Colonel Harrison's expression remained neutral as he gestured for her to take a seat. "Martinez," Colonel Harrison began, his voice carrying the formal tone that made it impossible to predict what would come next. "Captain Martinez has submitted his reconnaissance report, and I want you to hear his findings directly." Captain Martinez opened a folder and consulted his notes before speaking. The road you identified is not only passable, but represents one of the most strategically sound convoy routes I've evaluated in 15 years of military service. The engineering is exceptional, clearly designed by people who understood both tactical advantages and logistical requirements. The communication relay stations you mentioned are not only functional, but have been maintained in excellent condition, apparently by local military units who have been using the road for routine operations. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she maintained her military posture and waited for the complete assessment. Captain Martinez continued his report, describing how the route provided natural defensive positions, multiple escape options if trouble arose, and clear sight lines that would allow convoy leaders to spot potential problems well in advance of encountering them. More importantly, Captain Martinez added, looking directly at Sarah, your analysis of the security advantages was completely accurate. The route eliminates every single ambush point that concerned us about the primary corridor, while reducing travel time by approximately 90 minutes. It's not just a viable alternative, it's actually superior to our original plan in every measurable way. Colonel Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his intense gaze focused on Sarah. Captain Martinez also discovered something else during his reconnaissance mission. It seems that local military commanders have been using your route for supply operations for several months, but somehow this information never made it into our planning databases. Your research identified a strategic asset that our intelligence network had completely overlooked. The implications of this statement hung in the air as Sarah processed what she was hearing. Not only had her analysis been correct, but she had uncovered a systemic failure in information sharing that could have cost lives if not discovered. The realization was both vindicating and sobering, highlighting how much critical information could slip through cracks in even well-organized military systems. Major Peterson spoke for the first time since Sarah had entered the office. Martinez, I owe you an apology. When you first approached us with your route suggestion, I dismissed your input based on your assignment rather than evaluating your qualifications or the quality of your research. That was a mistake that could have had serious consequences. Sarah appreciated the apology, but she was more interested in what would happen next. The convoy mission was scheduled to depart in less than 24 hours, and she assumed that her role in the planning was complete now that her route recommendation had been validated. She couldn't have been more wrong about what Colonel Harrison had planned for her immediate future. Martinez, based on your demonstrated analytical capabilities and your intimate knowledge of this route, I'm temporarily reassigning you to the strategic planning team for this operation, Colonel Harrison announced. You'll work directly with Major Peterson to coordinate the convoy logistics and serve as the primary point of contact for route-related questions or modifications. Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to process this unexpected development. Just a week ago, she had been invisible support staff, serving coffee and cleaning tables. Now she was being assigned to strategic planning for a critical military operation, working alongside the same officers who had initially dismissed her capabilities. The transition felt surreal, but she knew this was exactly the kind of opportunity she had dreamed about when she first joined the military. Sir, I'm honored by your confidence in my abilities, Sarah replied, but I want to ensure I'm fully prepared for this responsibility. What specific duties would you expect me to perform in this role? Major Peterson answered her question. Martinez, you'll be responsible for liaison duties with the convoy commander, ensuring that route modifications can be communicated and implemented quickly if circumstances change. You'll also monitor intelligence reports for any new information that might affect the security situation along your recommended route. Most importantly, you'll serve as the subject matter expert on the geographical and tactical aspects of the corridor. The weight of responsibility felt enormous, but Sarah also felt a surge of excitement at finally being able to use her training in ways that mattered. This was what she had envisioned when she decided to join the military, contributing her skills to missions that protected lives and served national interests. The fact that her opportunity had come through coffee duty rather than traditional channels only made it more meaningful. Over the next 18 hours, Sarah worked alongside Major Peterson and the strategic planning team to finalize convoy preparations. She reviewed intelligence updates, coordinated with communication specialists to ensure the relay stations would be properly utilized, and briefed convoy commanders on the specific advantages and potential challenges of the route she had discovered. For the first time since joining the military, she felt like she was operating at her full potential. The convoy departed at dawn, and Sarah found herself in the communications center monitoring their progress in real time. As the vehicles moved along her recommended route, she tracked their position using GPS coordinates and maintained contact with the convoy commander through the strategic relay points she had identified. Every checkpoint confirmation felt like validation of her analytical work, but she knew the mission wouldn't be truly successful until all vehicles reached their destination safely. 3 hours into the journey, the convoy encountered their first significant challenge when road construction forced a temporary detour from the planned route. Sarah quickly consulted her research materials and identified an alternate path that would allow them to rejoin the main corridor within 15 minutes. Her quick thinking and detailed knowledge of the geographical area enabled the convoy to adapt to changing conditions without significant delay or increased risk. By midday, the convoy had successfully navigated the most challenging sections of the route and was approaching the final stretch to their destination. Sarah monitored communications from the command center, coordinating with intelligence units to ensure that no new threats had emerged in the target area. The mission was proceeding exactly as planned, validating not just her route recommendation, but also her ability to contribute meaningfully to strategic operations. When the convoy commander reported successful arrival at their destination with all vehicles and personnel accounted for, Sarah felt a combination of relief, pride, and anticipation about what would happen next. She had proven that her analytical skills could contribute to successful military operations, but she also knew that this single success would need to be followed by consistent performance if she wanted to transition permanently from support duties to strategic roles. Colonel Harrison appeared in the communications center as Sarah was filing her final mission report. Martinez, excellent work coordinating the convoy support. The mission commander specifically requested that I pass along his appreciation for your route recommendation and real-time support during the operation. Sarah stood at attention as Colonel Harrison approached her workstation. Thank you, sir. I'm glad I could contribute to a successful mission. Martinez, we need to discuss your future assignment, Colonel Harrison said. Your performance over the past week has demonstrated capabilities that are clearly being wasted in your current role. However, transitioning you to strategic planning would require formal reassignment procedures and additional training certifications. I need to know if you're committed to pursuing this path, understanding that it would mean significantly increased responsibilities and expectations. Sarah had dreamed of this moment for months, but now that it was happening, she felt the full weight of the decision before her. Accepting Colonel Harrison's offer would mean leaving behind the safety and predictability of support duties for the challenges and pressures of strategic work. It would mean proving herself repeatedly in an environment where mistakes could have serious consequences. But it also meant finally being able to use her training and analytical skills in ways that could make a real difference. Sir, I'm absolutely committed to pursuing strategic planning responsibilities, Sarah replied without hesitation. This week has shown me what I'm capable of contributing to military operations, and I want to continue developing those capabilities in service to my country. Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly. Good. Report to Major Peterson tomorrow morning at 0800. You'll begin cross-training in advanced strategic analysis while maintaining your current security clearance level. Your performance will be evaluated continuously, and permanent reassignment will depend on your ability to meet the standards expected of strategic planning personnel. As Sarah left the communications center that evening, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from coffee duty to strategic planning in just 1 week. The transition had required courage, determination, and willingness to risk everything on her belief in her own capabilities. But most importantly, it had required her to recognize that opportunity often comes disguised as routine work, and that excellence in any role can become the foundation for advancement to greater responsibilities. That night, Sarah called her father to share the news of her successful mission and upcoming reassignment. His pride was evident in his voice as he listened to her describe how her route recommendation had saved time and potentially lives during the convoy operation. But his response captured the essence of what she had learned about military service and personal growth. "Mija," he said, "I told you that sometimes invisible people are the ones who see everything. But what I didn't tell you is that the best way to stop being invisible is to prove that you see things others miss, and then do something meaningful with that insight. You didn't just find a better route. You showed them who you really are and what you're capable of becoming." As Sarah prepared for sleep at her barracks, she knew that her real military career was just beginning. The coffee duty assignment that had seemed like such a devastating disappointment had actually provided her with the perfect vantage point to observe, learn, and ultimately demonstrate her true value to the organization. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and greater responsibilities, but she would face them with the confidence that comes from proving yourself when the stakes are real and the mission matters. 6 months had passed since Sarah's transition from coffee duty to strategic planning, and the transformation had been nothing short of remarkable. What began as a temporary assignment to support a single convoy mission had evolved into a permanent role that showcased her analytical abilities and strategic thinking on an almost daily basis. But the biggest test of her career was about to unfold in ways she could never have anticipated. Sarah now worked in a spacious office adjacent to the main planning center, her walls covered with maps, intelligence reports, and commendations for successful mission support. She had proven herself through dozens of assignments, from route planning to threat assessment to resource allocation analysis. Her reputation had spread throughout the base and beyond, with other units requesting her expertise for their most challenging logistical problems. The morning that would define her military legacy began like any other, with Sarah reviewing overnight intelligence reports while sipping coffee that she now had time to properly enjoy rather than simply serve to others. Major Peterson knocked on her office door at precisely 0730, but his usual confident demeanor was replaced by an expression of barely controlled urgency that immediately commanded her attention. "Martinez, we have a situation that requires your immediate input," Major Peterson said as he entered her office carrying a folder marked with the highest classification levels. "Command has authorized Operation Thunderstrike, a major offensive that depends entirely on precise coordination of multiple military units across a complex geographical area. The initial planning has been completed, but something doesn't feel right about the logistics coordination." Sarah set down her coffee and focused completely on Major Peterson's briefing. Operation Thunderstrike was the largest military action plan for their theater in over 2 years, involving coordinated movements of ground forces, air support, and supply chains across a region that presented significant geographical and tactical challenges. The success or failure of the operation would affect not just military objectives, but also the safety of thousands of personnel and the strategic position of American forces in the entire region. "What specific concerns do you have about the current planning?" Sarah asked as she cleared her desk to accommodate the detailed maps and operational documents that Major Peterson was spreading out before her. "The timeline," Major Peterson replied grimly. "According to the current plan, all units need to be in position within 72 hours, with synchronized attacks beginning at exactly 0600 on Thursday morning. The logistics coordination requires precise timing of supply convoys, troop movements, and equipment positioning across 12 different tactical zones. One significant delay anywhere in the system could compromise the entire operation." Sarah studied the operational map that covered most of her desk surface, noting the complexity of coordinating so many moving elements across challenging terrain. The plan was ambitious and comprehensive, clearly developed by experienced strategic planners who understood the tactical requirements for success. But as she traced the various movement corridors and supply routes, she began to identify potential bottlenecks and coordination challenges that could create exactly the kind of delays that Major Peterson was worried about. Major, has anyone conducted a comprehensive timeline analysis that accounts for real-world variables like weather delays, mechanical problems, or unexpected terrain challenges? Sarah asked as she continued studying the operational details. That's exactly why I'm bringing this to you, Major Peterson replied. The initial planning assumed optimal conditions for all movements, but we both know that military operations never proceed under optimal conditions. I need you to conduct a realistic assessment of the timeline and identify potential failure points that could dirge the synchronized timing. For the next 6 hours, Sarah immersed herself completely in the operational details of Thunderstrike. She analyzed weather forecasts, studied historical data about equipment reliability in the target region, reviewed terrain challenges that could affect convoy speeds, and calculated realistic timeframes for complex logistical movements. What she discovered was both more concerning and more solvable than anyone had anticipated. The current plan contained multiple critical vulnerabilities that could cascade into mission failure if not addressed immediately. Supply convoys were scheduled to travel through areas where seasonal weather patterns made road conditions unpredictable. Equipment positioning relied on air transport during time periods when fog and low visibility frequently grounded aircraft. Most critically, the entire operation depended on a complex sequence of coordinated movements that allowed no margin for error or unexpected delays. But as Sarah worked through the analytical process that had served her so well since leaving coffee duty, she began to identify modifications that could address the vulnerabilities without requiring major changes to the overall operational strategy. Her solution would require careful coordination and some unconventional approaches, but it could transform Operation Thunderstrike from a high-risk gamble into a well-planned mission with multiple contingency options. That afternoon, Sarah requested a meeting with Colonel Harrison and the senior planning staff to present her findings. As she prepared her presentation, she reflected on how different this moment felt compared to her first strategic briefing 6 months earlier. Then, she had been a support staff member desperately trying to prove her value through a single route recommendation. Now, she was a recognized strategic analyst whose input could influence one of the most important military operations in recent memory. The briefing room was crowded with senior officers, including some she had never seen before who had clearly been brought in specifically for Operation Thunderstrike planning. Colonel Harrison introduced her to the group as one of our most skilled analytical assets, a description that would have seemed impossible when she was serving coffee in this same building just months earlier. Gentlemen, Martinez has conducted a comprehensive timeline analysis of Operation Thunderstrike, and her findings require immediate attention, Colonel Harrison announced as Sarah connected her laptop to the briefing room projection system. I've asked her to present her assessment and recommendations to this group before we finalize operational orders. Sarah took a deep breath and began her presentation, walking the senior staff through each element of the operation while highlighting the specific vulnerabilities she had identified. She used charts, graphs, and detailed timeline analysis to demonstrate how seemingly minor delays could compound into major problems that would compromise mission timing and potentially endanger personnel. The current plan assumes that all convoy movements will proceed at optimal speeds, but historical data for this region shows that weather conditions create significant delays approximately 40% of the time during this season, Sarah explained as she displayed her analytical findings. Additionally, the air transport schedule for equipment positioning conflicts with established weather patterns that reduce visibility below safe flying minimums. General Morrison, the operation commander who had been brought in specifically for Thunderstrike, interrupted her presentation with a question that made Sarah's heart race. Martinez, are you suggesting that we delay this operation? Because the timing has been coordinated with broader strategic objectives that cannot be modified. No, sir, Sarah replied confidently. I'm suggesting modifications that would maintain the operational timeline while building in contingency options that address the identified vulnerabilities. The changes I'm recommending would actually improve our probability of success while maintaining the synchronized timing that makes this operation strategically viable. For the next 30 minutes, Sarah outlined her recommended modifications to Operation Thunderstrike. She proposed alternative convoy routes that would be less susceptible to weather delays, suggested equipment pre-positioning strategies that would reduce dependence on time-sensitive air transport, and identified backup communication protocols that would allow continued coordination even if primary systems failed. Most importantly, she recommended a staggered implementation approach that would allow operational flexibility while maintaining the synchronized attack timing that was critical to mission success. Her modifications were detailed, practical, and addressed every major vulnerability she had identified without requiring changes to the fundamental strategic objectives. As Sarah concluded her presentation, the briefing room fell silent while senior officers absorbed the implications of her analysis and recommendations. She had essentially demonstrated that the original plan, while tactically sound, contained logistical vulnerabilities that could lead to mission failure. But she had also provided a roadmap for addressing those vulnerabilities in ways that would actually strengthen the operation. General Morrison was the first to speak. Martinez, your analysis identifies problems that none of our planning teams caught during months of preparation. How confident are you in these timeline projections and the effectiveness of your recommended modifications? Sir, I'm confident enough to stake my military career on these recommendations, Sarah replied without hesitation. The analytical methods I've used are based on historical data and established logistics principles. The modifications I'm suggesting have been tested in similar operations with documented success rates. Colonel Harrison looked around the room at his senior staff. Gentlemen, we have a decision to make. We can proceed with the original plan and accept the risks that Martinez has identified, or we can implement her modifications and potentially avoid catastrophic timing failures. I want her input, but I need a consensus within the hour. The discussion that followed demonstrated the complexity of military decision-making at the highest levels. Officers raised concerns about last-minute changes to complex operations, questioned whether Sarah's analysis was overly conservative, and debated the risks of both action and inaction. But as the debate continued, it became clear that her recommendations were gaining support from officers who understood that successful operations required adaptation to real-world conditions. Major Peterson spoke in support of implementing Sarah's modifications. Martinez has consistently demonstrated analytical abilities that exceed what we normally see from strategic planning personnel. Her track record over the past 6 months includes multiple successful mission support operations, and her methods have proven reliable under pressure. General Morrison made the final decision. We'll implement Martinez's modifications to Operation Thunderstrike. I want revised operational orders prepared immediately, with all relevant commanders briefed on the changes within 6 hours. Martinez, you'll serve as the primary logistics coordinator for this operation, reporting directly to my staff throughout the mission. As the briefing room emptied, Sarah realized that she had just achieved something that would have seemed impossible during her coffee duty assignment. She had influenced a major military operation at the highest strategic level, ensuring that thousands of service members would have the best possible chance for mission success and safe return. The journey from serving coffee to coordinating critical military logistics had been completed in less than 7 months. Operation Thunderstrike launched exactly as scheduled 3 days later, with Sarah coordinating logistics support from the main command center. Her modifications proved essential when weather delays affected 3 different convoy routes. Equipment transport schedules had to be adjusted due to mechanical problems, and communication systems experienced intermittent failures in 2 tactical zones. But because her contingency planning had anticipated these challenges, The operation continued without compromise to the synchronized timing that was critical for success. When General Morrison announced the successful completion of Operation Thunderstrike 48 hours later, he specifically mentioned Sarah's contribution to mission planning and execution. The analytical work and logistics coordination provided by Lieutenant Martinez were instrumental in overcoming challenges that could have compromised this operation. Her recommendations transformed a high-risk mission into a well-coordinated success. 6 weeks after Operation Thunderstrike, Sarah received orders promoting her to lieutenant and assigning her to the Strategic Analysis Division at Pentagon headquarters. The promotion came with responsibilities that would have seemed impossible when she was assigned to coffee duty, but it also represented validation of everything she had worked to achieve since joining the military. On her final day at the base, Sarah returned to the officers' mess where her transformation had begun. Sergeant Williams, who still managed the facility, greeted her with the kind of pride that comes from watching someone exceed every expectation. As they talked about her journey from coffee duty to strategic planning, Sarah realized how much she had learned about perseverance, opportunity, and the importance of excellence in any role. "You know, Martinez," Sergeant Williams said as they stood in the dining area where she had first overheard the convoy planning discussion, "I've seen a lot of soldiers come through here over the years. Most of them see support duties as something to get through before moving on to their real careers. But you showed everyone that any job can become the foundation for something greater if you approach it with the right attitude and determination." As Sarah packed her belongings and prepared to leave for Washington, she reflected on the lessons that coffee duty had taught her about military service and personal growth. She had learned that opportunity often comes disguised as routine work, that excellence in any role can become the pathway to greater responsibilities, and that the courage to speak up when you have valuable insights can change the trajectory of an entire career. The last item Sarah packed was a photo from Operation Thunderstrike, showing her working alongside General Morrison and other senior officers in the command center. It represented the culmination of a journey that had begun with disappointment and uncertainty, but had led to achievements beyond her original dreams. As she looked at the photo, Sarah smiled, knowing that her father had been right about invisible people sometimes being the ones who see everything, and sometimes being the ones who change everything when the moment is right. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez left that base with orders that would take her to the highest levels of military strategic planning, but she would never forget that her success had been built on a foundation of excellence in coffee duty, careful observation of strategic planning processes, and the courage to contribute her insights when lives were at stake. The coffee pot and serving trays had been replaced by computers and strategic planning software, but the analytical mind and determination that had served her in the officer's mess would continue to serve her country in whatever challenges lay ahead.